In 1885, when the Great Smoky Mountains still lay shrouded in the kind of mist that swallowed entire worlds, the Pettin name moved through the hollows like a whispered warning. The mountains along the North Carolina Tennessee border rose and folded like the ribs of some ancient creature, each hollow deeper than the last, each ridge carrying stories older than the people who settled there. These were not the softened, well-marked trails future tourists would someday tread. No, this was wilderness untouched, a labyrinth of shadowed valleys, copper-rich streams, hidden ravines, and slopes so steep the sun struggled to touch them even at noon. Deep in one of these forgotten pockets of the world stood the Pettin Mansion, a structure so out of place amid the rugged landscape that it seemed less built than imposed. The trail that reached it coiled upward for 15 treacherous miles, a narrow path where roots waited to catch travelers unaware and mists thickened into veils that concealed everything more than an arm's length away. But for those who reached the top, the site of the mansion, rising 3 stories high, its white columns stretching skyward like pillars of an old temple, was enough to unsettle even the bravest mountaineer. The Pettin fortune, whispered about but never fully understood, had its roots entangled in the ugliest parts of Southern history. Josiah Pettin, patriarch and unquestioned ruler of his family's isolated kingdom, had inherited land, enslaved labor, and a belief in his own divine appointment. Even after the Civil War dismantled the legal scaffolding of slavery, the Pettins maintained control over the families who lived on their land through debts, contracts, and isolation so absolute it may as well have been iron chains. Their estate operated like its own country, self-contained, self-governing, and ruled by the strict philosophy Josiah called the Pettin Covenant, a doctrine he crafted through a tangled union of scripture, pseudo-science, and delusions of spiritual superiority. His daughters Eleanor and Cassandra grew up within this insulated world. From childhood they were taught that their lineage was pure, and that purity was fragile, delicate, something easily corrupted by outsiders. They saw few visitors and fewer friends, their social world consisting almost entirely of Josiah, the 2 brothers who orbited the family like obedient satellites, and the workers who kept a wary distance from the mansion's inner workings. To the people of Millbrook Crossing, the nearest settlement, little more than a smattering of cabins, a general store, and a church, the Pettins were a mixture of fascination and unease. Every few months, supplies arrived from Charleston or Knoxville in bulk, too much for a household of 5. Medical instruments wrapped in heavy paper, books bound in dark leather, boxes labeled with chemical names that no mountain doctor had reason to order, and when the family did travel into town, their presence stirred gossip as quickly as wind stirs leaves across a ridge. Josiah walked as though he owned not just the land but the very air around him. The daughters moved with eerie poise, their eyes too calm, their composure too perfect. No suitors visited, no acquaintances lingered. No one dared ask why the family was so committed to living behind a veil of silence. It was only much later, after the truth bled through the cracks, that people understood they had never been witnessing eccentricity. They had been witnessing the first tremors of a nightmare, the first whispers that something was deeply amiss on the Pettin estate drifted into Millbrook Crossing in the early 1890s, carried not by bold men or official reports, but by tired laborers returning from seasonal work. Mountain gossip was as old as the ridges themselves. Stories grew, shifted, twisted, but these murmurs had a weight to them that couldn't be dismissed as idle talk. Workers spoke in low voices, glancing around as if the fog itself might be listening. They talked of crates delivered to the mansion that no ordinary household would ever require, chloroform in heavy glass bottles, laudanum by the case, surgical tools wrapped in oilcloth, and obstetrical equipment that looked more suited for a city hospital than a remote mountain home. These supplies arrived regularly, brought up the mountain trail under strict instructions not to be opened or inspected, Payments were generous, too generous, and always made in cash, yet, despite the constant delivery of medical goods, no one ever saw children on the property. Several workers claimed to have seen Eleanor or Cassandra with swelling at the waist, unmistakable signs of pregnancy, even among those who had no education beyond what mountain life demanded. But months later, the sisters would reappear with slim waists, expressionless faces, and no infant to be seen or heard. Some whispered that the babies had been sent away. Others suggested illness. But the more superstitious folk muttered about darker possibilities no one wanted to say aloud. The rhythm of life at the mansion only deepened these suspicions. The place had cycles, patterns of eerie silence followed by frenetic bursts of activity. For days at a time, the estate would lie still, with no movement near the windows and no footsteps echoing across the wraparound porch. Then, without warning, lanterns would burn until dawn, their glow flickering behind cellar grates. Workers would hear hurried footsteps, see shadows moving past drawn curtains, and smell the acrid sting of something burning, fabric, bedding, sometimes flesh, though no one dared confirm it. Most unsettling of all were the screams. Not loud, not frantic, just faint enough to make a listener question whether they had heard anything at all. But those who had spent enough nights on the estate swore the sounds did not belong to wildcats or coyotes. These were human cries, strangled by walls too thick and secrets too heavy. Still, isolation breeds tolerance. Strange happenings were often dismissed with a shrug. Mountain life demanded resilience, and the Pettons kept to themselves. People told themselves that the wealthy had odd habits, that old families clung to peculiar traditions, and besides, no one wanted trouble with a household as powerful as the Pettons. Their influence seeped through the region like groundwater, unseen, but always there. Yet as the years passed, the tragedies began to accumulate. One by one, branches of the Petton family tree seemed to snap, a son vanishing without forwarding address, another dead in what the neighborhood whispered was not an accident. A pattern blurred by time, but unmistakable to those who watched closely. The truth was taking shape, but like the mountains at dawn, it was only beginning to emerge from the mist. By the dawn of the 20th century, the tragedies orbiting the Petton family had grown too numerous to ignore, though each incident, examined alone, appeared tragically ordinary for mountain life. Folks in Millbrook Crossing whispered, but their whispers lacked the courage to form conclusions. The Smokies were full of disappearances, accidents, and men who left home without looking back. Hard living made hard stories. Still, certain details clung to memory like burrs. Samuel Petton, the youngest of the siblings, was said to have stormed off the estate in 1906 after a violent quarrel with his father. According to the official line, he left on foot with no supplies and vanished into the ridges. No one wrote to him and he never wrote back. For most folks, this explanation was acceptable. Sons stormed off all the time, some returned, some didn't. The mountains swallowed men who weren't strong enough to master them. But there was something odd in the way the Petton sisters spoke of Samuel afterward, when they spoke of him at all. Their voices carried a peculiar stillness, a strange absence where grief should have lived. Those who encountered Eleanor or Cassandra around that time remembered how the sisters' expressions remained fixed and composed, as though Samuel's vanishing had brought not sorrow, but relief. And then came Benjamin's death in 1909. His passing, recorded as a hunting accident, sent ripples through the region. Benjamin had been the most visible of the Petton heirs. He came to town more often than his siblings, paid his bills promptly, and traded fairly with the merchants. He spoke of marriage to a young woman from Millbrook Crossing, a rumor that had set tongues wagging for months. Yet on the morning he was found dead, several workers swore they had heard raised voices coming from the mansion's parlor. The topic of the argument, they claimed, was Benjamin's insistence on leaving the estate to make a life with the woman he loved. Eleanor and Cassandra had opposed him with a vehemence that disturbed even those accustomed to the Pettons' private ways. Later that day, Benjamin's body was discovered with a bullet wound that did not quite match the story the family offered, but the family physician, now long dead, signed the death certificate without hesitation, and the matter was quietly laid to rest. As the years passed, the Petton household grew quieter, emptier, yet oddly more serene. With each death, each disappearance, the sisters seemed less burdened, as though their world grew lighter with fewer witnesses to share it. Their trips into town dwindled until months would pass without anyone seeing them, and when they did appear, dressed neatly, faces calm, voices smooth, they gave the impression of women who had completed some solemn commandment known only to them. Still, the mountain kept its secrets. Outsiders rarely pried, folks minded their own business, and the Petton sisters continued their insulated existence atop the ridge, their family tree shedding branches one by one. But fate has a way of aligning itself with truth, and truth, though slow, is relentless. The beginning of its arrival came in the spring of 1910, in the form of a man who thought he was simply delivering legal papers. He would soon learn that the past 30 years of Petton silence hid horrors older than any mountain legend. The lockbox weighed almost nothing, but to Deputy Carver it felt like a brick of sin. The wax seal, cracked by the floodwaters, still clung to the edges like dried blood. He carried it to the lantern-lit desk at the back of the ruined county office, where mud streaked the floor and files floated like drowned ghosts. He didn't want to open it. Everyone in the Ozarks already whispered that the triplet girls weren't right, too quiet, too watchful, always moving like shadows stitched together. Folks said their father kept them hidden from the world because they were delicate. Others claimed he kept them hidden because he was guilty. Deputy Carver had heard the rumors. He never believed them. Not until the flood brought the lockbox up from the crawlspace under the collapsed homestead. Not until he saw the initials pressed into the wax, E.J.H. Elijah James Harper, the father. Carver broke the seal with the tip of his knife. The lid creaked open, and the lantern flame shivered as if recoiling from whatever waited inside. There were no coins, no deeds, no family Bible, only a stack of small, cloth-bound notebooks, each labeled by year: 1881, 1882, 1883, 1884, 12 of them. Carver lifted the first one. The pages were water, warped, the ink blurred, but the handwriting was unmistakably a man's. The first line he could still read: "God forgive me for what my daughters have become and for what I've allowed." He stopped. His mouth went dry. The rain hammered the roof harder, like it wanted him to close the box and leave the truth buried with the house. But he kept reading, and each line sank deeper into him than the last. The notebooks didn't just contain a father's confession. They contained a history of a family rotting from the inside, year by year, breath by breath. And by the time Carver reached the last page, he understood why the girls never went to school, why the neighbors heard screams that were never explained, why the mother had vanished long before anyone started asking questions. But worse than any of that, he understood why Elijah Harper had written, "If anyone finds this, know that the sin is shared," because the triplets, barely 20 but with eyes older than any grave, had signed their names on the final page. They had written, "We are not victims, we chose, we remain." Carver slammed the book shut, but it was too late. The truth was out of the box now, and it would not go back in. By dawn, the storm had thinned into a cold mist that curled low across the riverbanks. Deputy Carver hadn't slept, not after reading the final page of the notebooks. The office was quiet, empty, except for the ceaseless dripping of rainwater through the broken ceiling. He kept replaying the signatures at the end of the last journal. 3 names, 3 slanted, deliberate strokes of ink, the Harper triplets. No one had seen them since the night the homestead collapsed. Some believed they'd drowned in the flood. Others swore they had seen shapes moving in the timberline at dusk, too tall for children, too thin for grown women. Carver tried to convince himself that the notebooks were the ravings of a man broken by isolation, but the feeling in his stomach disagreed. The handwriting had been too steady, the entries too consistent, the tone too calm. He sealed the notebooks back inside the box and wrapped it in oiled cloth. He planned to bring it to the judge in the next county. Whatever this was, it was bigger than a whispering mountain town. He blew out the lantern, pushed open the warped office door, and stepped outside. That's when he saw them. 3 sets of footprints, bare, small, and perfectly parallel, leading from the old river, crossing to the flooded road. The muddy impressions were fresh, too fresh. Carver crouched, brushing his fingers across one track. The edges were sharp, unsoftened by wind or rain. Whoever made them had passed less than an hour ago. His breath chilled. All 3 sets faced the same direction, toward the town. He straightened slowly, scanning the tree line. The woods were still, silent, but he felt watched, the kind of watchfulness that prickles the back of the neck, ancient and patient. He swallowed hard. If the sisters had survived, if they had read those notebooks too, if they had taken their father's words as something more than confession, then Carver wasn't holding evidence anymore. He was holding a warning, and somewhere beyond the fog, the Harper triplets were walking toward a place that had long forgotten them, but they had not forgotten it. Not at all. The town of Ridgetown woke slowly, the way mountain towns do, creaking porch boards, roosters arguing in the distance, stovepipes coughing out the first smoke of morning. No one noticed Deputy Carver at first as he crossed the muddy main road, boots heavy, eyes scanning every alley and doorway. He wasn't looking for trouble, he was looking for 3 shadows. The footprints had ended at the split rail fence beside the road. After that, nothing. No more tracks in the mud, no torn fabric, no signs of struggle. It was as if the triplets had stepped neatly into the town and dissolved into the waking fog. Carver forced himself to breathe normally. Panic wouldn't help, facts would. He stopped at the general store. Old Mr. Wilkes was sweeping the steps. "Morning, Deputy." Wilkes muttered, not looking up. "Anyone come through early?" Carver asked, keeping his voice steady. Wilkes paused, thinking. "Saw 3 girls by the river path about an hour ago. Thought they were from the Turner farm. Didn't wave, just stared." Carver's stomach dropped. "Did they say anything?" He pressed. "No," Wilkes said. But they all turned their heads the same way, same second, like they were one person wearing 3 bodies. He shivered despite himself, didn't like it. Carver thanked him and moved on. Down the street, Mrs. Lantry was feeding chickens. She said she'd heard tapping soft, rhythmic on her back window before sunrise. When she checked, no one was there, but muddy water still clung to the sill. At the mill, 2 workers claimed they'd seen figures standing on the ridge just before the fog lifted. They didn't wave, didn't move, just watched. Every story was the same, silent, still, watching. The triplets weren't hiding. They were letting the town know they were back. And then Carver heard the bell, a frantic clang from the far end of Main Street. The kind of alarm used only when someone was missing or found. He ran past the mill, past the stables, past the church where the pastor was already stepping outside, pale, faced and trembling. A crowd had gathered near the old boarding house. Women clutching their children, men whispering prayers they hadn't said in years. Carver pushed through them until he reached the porch. A suitcase lay there, water, damaged, half open. Inside were children's clothes, neatly folded. Beside it, written in wet mud on the porch planks, were 3 words drawn by 3 hands. "We remember them." Carver swallowed hard. The meaning was clear. The triplets hadn't returned for forgiveness. They'd returned for memory, and memory was never kind in the Ozarks. The boarding house porch creaked under Carver's weight as he knelt to study the muddy words again. "We remember them." The message wasn't a threat, not directly. It was something colder, something carved out of years of silence. Behind him, the townspeople murmured anxiously. "Who remembers who? What's this about they drowned? Didn't they?" Carver didn't answer. He didn't trust his voice. He stood and scanned the crowd. Their fear wasn't just for the triplets, it was for the past they'd all agreed, quietly and conveniently, to bury. Everyone in Ridgetown had known. Something was wrong at the Harper homestead long before the flood. They just never asked, never knocked, never helped, and now the town's forgotten daughters were walking its roads again. Carver motioned for the crowd to give him space. Inside the boarding house, the proprietor, a thin, trembling man named Harris, wiped sweat from his brow. "I didn't see them," Harris stammered before Carver could even ask. "But I heard someone come up the steps, soft, bare feet. I thought it was one of the lodger's children, but—" Then the tapping started. Tapping, Carver repeated. Harris nodded. 3 taps, then 3 more, then 3 again, slow. Like a signal. Carver felt the same chill he had when he first opened the lockbox. He checked the hallway, nothing disturbed, no doors forced. Whoever had been here hadn't come to break in. They'd come to leave a message, a reminder. When he stepped back outside, the pastor approached him, his hands shaking despite the warm morning air. "Deputy," he said, voice strained, "this isn't the first message." Carver stared at him. "Explain." The pastor swallowed. "Last week, before the flood, someone left a bundle on the church steps. Wrapped in burlap, inside were 3 wooden carvings. Small, rough, unfinished. Carvings of what? Carver asked. The pastor's eyes lifted toward the ridge above town. Girls, 3 girls, holding hands. Carver's pulse quickened. "Why didn't you report it?" "Because," the pastor whispered, "I thought it was the old stories coming back, and some sins. People here would rather leave alone." Carver exhaled heavily. This wasn't just about the father. This wasn't just about the homestead. The whole town had a piece in what happened to the triplets, or what they had become. And now the sisters were reminding Ridgetown of every name, every face, every silence that had allowed their suffering to grow in the dark. Carver looked back toward the flooded road where the footprints had first appeared. "If they're here," he said quietly, "they'll make themselves seen again." Mrs. Lantry, clutching her shawl, whispered the question everyone else was afraid to ask. "Deputy, what do they want?" Carver looked at the muddy message, at the abandoned suitcase, at the ridge where 3 silent figures might be watching even now. "They want," he said, "for this town to remember what it tried so hard to forget." By late afternoon, the fog had lifted from the valley, but a heavy quiet settled over Ridgetown, the kind that makes every door hinge sound louder, every whisper sharper. People stayed inside, curtains stayed half-drawn, mothers called children home early, even the dogs refused to wander far. Deputy Carver patrolled the edge of town alone. He didn't expect to find the triplets. He expected them to find him, and they did. It happened near the old mill road, where the forest pressed close and the shadows pooled early. Carver stopped when he noticed something odd. 3 stones stacked on the path, each marked with a single carved line, one vertical, one diagonal, one horizontal, a sign, a signal, left deliberately. He crouched to study them when a faint rustle drifted from the tree line. Not wind, not an animal, controlled, measured, waiting. Carver straightened slowly, hand resting near his holster, though he knew it would do little good. He took one careful step. That's when he saw her. One of the triplets stood between 2 oaks, her dress clinging damply to her thin frame. She didn't move, didn't blink. Her hair hung in tangled ropes, still wet from the floodwaters, but her eyes were clear, focused, and full of recognition. Lydia Harper. Carver whispered, unable to stop himself, her head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging the name, or testing how it sounded after so many years. She didn't speak, but she lifted one hand and tapped her fingers against the tree trunk. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, the same pattern Harris had heard at the boarding house. Carver forced his breath to steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." Lydia's expression didn't change, but another rustle came to the left this time. The second sister stepped out, then the third. They formed a perfect line behind Lydia, shoulder to shoulder, their pale faces emerging from the shadows like matching ghosts cut from the same cloth. All 3 pairs of eyes fixed on Carver. He had faced armed men, wild animals, even men gone mad from the mines, but nothing in his life had prepared him for the stillness of those 3 girls. Quiet around them wasn't normal. It felt older, deeper, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Lydia took 1 step forward. The others mirrored it perfectly. 3 steps in unison. That's when Carver noticed something chilling. Each girl carried something small in her left hand. A journal, water, damaged, identical to the ones he'd found in the lockbox. Lydia held hers out slightly, as if offering it. Not hostile, intentional. Carver swallowed. "You want me to read that?" No response, but Lydia placed the journal on the ground between them, then stepped back. The message was clear. They wanted him to know something the father hadn't written, something the town had never heard. Carver crouched slowly, reaching for the book. The moment his finger touched the cover, all three sisters turned their heads sharply, not at him, but toward the town behind him, as if listening, as if waiting, as if expecting something to begin. When Carver looked back up, they were gone, not running, not crashing through brush, just gone. Only the journal remained, and in the fading light, he opened it and read the first line. These are the things he did not confess. Deputy Carver sat on the muddy riverbank, the last light of day bleeding through the trees. The journal lay open on his knees, pages warped and stained by floodwater, but the words were still legible. The handwriting was delicate, meticulous, each line a careful record of deeds that no one in Ridgetown could have imagined. The first entries recounted ordinary things, the layout of the homestead, supplies needed, chores for workers, and seasonal patterns of the river. But as he read deeper, the tone shifted. The sentences became colder, more deliberate, almost clinical. This was not a diary of a girl's life. This was a ledger of something far darker, written by children who had grown up in shadows and silence. There were descriptions of whispered instructions from their father, Elijah Harper, the kinds of lessons that should never be taught to anyone, let alone daughters. Lessons in secrecy, obedience, and the careful management of appearances. Every neighborly greeting, every festival, every casual interaction with the outside world was catalogued, measured, and noted for potential exposure. Carver's fingers trembled as he turned the pages. There were sections detailing strange experiments with plants and herbs, remedies for illness, and measures to keep the children of the valley healthy, but interlaced with these were subtle hints of manipulation, coercion, and control. The Harper girls had learned from a young age how to orchestrate the world around them, who to trust, who to avoid, and how to shape the story of their family before anyone could speak against them. One entry stopped him cold. It was brief, written in tight, precise lettering. "We are not powerless. He is gone, but his lessons remain. We follow the covenant. The valley watches. The town forgets. We will remember." The words carried a weight far beyond their size. The flood, the lockbox, the journals, it was all part of a chain of events that had now placed the power of the story in the hands of the triplets. Carver realized that the journal was not just a record of history, it was a map. A warning, a ledger of intentions that spanned decades. The final pages contained a list of names, neighbors, workers, and distant relatives, each marked with symbols he didn't recognize at first. Small circles, triangles, and crosses that seemed to denote more than lineage or property. He flipped through slowly, sensing a rhythm. It was a ledger of attention, of oversight. The Harper sisters had catalogued every human being within reach of the homestead, noting loyalty, observation, and potential threats. Carver closed the journal for a moment, leaning back against the riverbank. The gravity of what he had uncovered pressed on him like the mist rolling down from the ridges. The flood had exposed the past, the sisters had returned to deliver the message, and the town, if it remained ignorant, would never be ready for what was to come. He opened the journal again, reading the last entry. "Some things are buried, not for our sake, but for theirs. We are the keepers now, and we have always been." The river moved silently beside him. The journal trembled in his hands. Somewhere in the darkening hills, the triplets watched, waited, and remembered. The next morning, the sun struggled to pierce the heavy mist that lingered over the Ozarks. Deputy Carver, still clutching the Harper journal, followed the muddy tracks back toward the ridge where the triplets had last been seen. Each footprint, each indentation in the soft earth, seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. He realized something unsettling. The sisters had been everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The journal hinted at movements, routines, and a silent watch over the valley spanning decades. Every birth, every disappearance, Every act of cruelty or care was accounted for. They weren't just survivors, they were orchestrators. Carver reviewed the names listed in the journal. Some were townsfolk, some were old workers from the homestead, some were strangers who had wandered too close to the valley. Beside each name, he noticed subtle annotations, lines, dots, and marks that seemed to indicate behavior, loyalty, or compliance. It wasn't random, it was a pattern. The realization made his stomach twist. The triplets had spent their entire lives mapping human behavior. They had watched, recorded, and predicted the valley's responses to every whisper, every rumor, every tragedy. No one had escaped their gaze, not the neighbors, not the workers, not even the local clergy. Carver's eyes traced the river's bend. There, faint against the morning light, were the remnants of tiny footprints leading into the woods. Bare, small, deliberate, he followed them slowly, sensing the rhythm. 3 steps forward, pause, 3 steps forward, pause. He felt as if the land itself conspired with the sisters, guiding him toward understanding. By midday, he reached a clearing, and the wind carried a faint sound, the whisper of cloth brushing against leaves. He froze. The journal was heavy in his hands, but he dared not open it again. Instead, he scanned the trees. Shadows moved where shadows shouldn't. Shapes too small, too thin, yet precise, slipped among the trunks. Then Carver saw them, 3 figures stepping lightly, circling the clearing in perfect formation. Their eyes met his for a heartbeat, calculating, unyielding, ancient in their knowing. The triplets didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence communicated everything. They had always known, they had always planned, and they were always in control. Carver's mind raced as he tried to piece together the implications. The journal had revealed patterns, yes, but the sisters themselves were living proof. Every tragedy, every whispered rumor, every act of concealment had been intentional, a part of a larger design only they fully understood. One of them paused and tapped a stick against the ground. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more. The rhythm echoed the tapping he had heard before at the boarding house, at the mill, at the river. It wasn't a signal for attention. It was a count. Carver's heart pounded. He realized that the valley itself was a ledger, the journal, the floods, the abandoned homestead, even the town's silence, all entries in a record that only the Harper sisters could read completely. And in that moment, he understood the chilling truth. The sisters didn't merely survive the horrors of their upbringing. They had mastered them. They had turned every shadow into a tool, every secret into power, and every step into a message. Carver exhaled slowly, aware that he had only begun to comprehend the scope of their influence. The Ozarks were no longer just a mountain range. They were a map of human behavior, authored by the 3 girls who had refused to be forgotten. By dusk, the valley was a patchwork of shadows and mist, each ridge curling like the pages of a book too long unread. Deputy Carver returned to the remains of the Harper homestead, carrying the journal like a talisman against the unseen. He knew the triplets had left signs everywhere, but he needed more than footprints and whispered warnings. He needed proof. Inside the cellar, mud, caked and smelling of rot, he noticed something he hadn't before. A small, half-buried trapdoor tucked into the corner, hidden beneath a heap of broken floorboards. It had been overlooked during the flood, overlooked by everyone. The edge of the wood was warped, but the hinges were intact. Carver's heart pounded. He pried it open. The smell of damp earth rose immediately, heavy and suffocating. The light from his lantern fell on a shallow staircase leading downward, carved crudely but clearly used for decades. The journal seemed to grow heavier in his hands, as if urging him to turn back or to go deeper. Step by step, he descended. The space below was narrow, just enough for one person to crouch, and there it was, a ledger. A long, wooden, bound book, thick with dust and the weight of secrecy. Unlike the journal, this ledger was unmistakably the work of the sisters themselves. The handwriting was precise, almost architectural, detailing names, dates, events, and codes that Carver could only begin to decipher. He flipped the pages slowly, his lantern flickering across symbols, check marks, and cryptic annotations. Entire sections detailed disappearances in the valley over the previous 30 years, workers who vanished, infants who never reached adulthood, neighbors who moved away under unexplained circumstances. Beside each entry was a mark, a triangle, circle, or line. Some had small notes in the margins: observed, removed, compliant. Carver felt a chill as he read the ledger. The pattern was horrifying. The sisters had been keeping watch over everyone, documenting behaviors, predicting outcomes, and determining who would remain and who would vanish. The ledger wasn't just a record. It was a plan, a map of control, drawn over decades with meticulous care. At the bottom of one page, he saw a familiar series of initials, his own. Carver froze. Had they known he would come, or was it simply the inevitability of their reach? The ledger seemed to whisper in the cold cellar air, "We remember everything, even you." He realized the valley itself was no longer just a place. It was a stage. Every path, every river bend, every abandoned homestead and flooded office became part of the sisters' experiment in observation and influence. And now, with the ledger in his hands, Carver understood that the truth would be far more complicated, far more dangerous than anyone in Ridgetown could imagine. As he turned the last page, a small folded note fell out, damp but intact. The writing was unmistakable, 3 sets of identical slanted strokes. The message was brief, chilling. "The covenant continues. Watch closely. Do not forget." Carver pressed the ledger to his chest. He had proof, but he also understood something deeper. The Harper triplets were not just survivors, not merely orchestrators of past horrors. They were the valley itself, alive and watching, and he was in their hands. The sun had long disappeared behind the ridges, leaving the valley cloaked in near-total darkness. Deputy Carver returned to the edge of the forest, the ledger pressed tightly against his chest. Every instinct told him he was walking into the heart of the Harper sisters' power, but he knew there was no turning back. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint sound, the tapping he had heard before. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, a rhythm so precise it could not have been accidental. Carver slowed, eyes scanning every shadow, every tree trunk. His lantern barely pierced the mist, casting long, trembling shapes on the ground. Then he saw them. The triplets stood on a small rise, 3 figures perfectly aligned, their pale faces almost glowing in the lantern light. They didn't move toward him, yet their presence filled the clearing as if the air itself had weight. Carver took a steadying breath. "I know what you've done," he said, voice firm despite the cold clenching his stomach. "I've seen the journals, I've seen the ledger. I know what you've been keeping, and I'm here to stop it." The sisters tilted their heads, speaking as one in a voice soft and deliberate. "Stop what, Deputy? The valley is not ours. It has always been this way. We merely watch. We preserve what others cannot see." Carver's hand hovered near the ledger. "You've hidden crimes, you've manipulated lives, people have disappeared, children, neighbors, family. It ends now." A small laugh, almost musical, echoed across the trees. It wasn't mocking, it was measured. "Ends? You think you can end what began long before you were born? We remember every step, every lie, every failure of this town, and now you too will remember." Carver swallowed hard. He realized then that the sisters' power was not physical, but psychological. They had mastered fear, control, and observation. Every citizen, every worker, every child in the valley had been catalogued, predicted, and manipulated, and he was just another line in their ledger. One of the sisters, Lydia, stepped forward, holding out her hand. In it was a small notebook, identical to the journal he had discovered. "Read," she said, "understand, or forget, and risk what the valley will remember without mercy." Carver hesitated, but the ledger in his hands had already prepared him. He opened the sister's notebook, eyes scanning the precise entries, timelines, names, rituals, and patterns. It was all there, everything the town had forgotten, every atrocity obscured by distance and silence. The 3 sisters watched him silently as he read, each word etched into his mind like a shadow across the valley. When he looked up, they were closer, yet still perfectly composed, still unreadable, as if the very forest itself bowed to their presence. "You see," Lydia said, voice echoing softly through the mist, "the valley is ours to remember, and now you are part of it." Carver understood. This was no longer a confrontation of fists or guns. It was a test of endurance, of observation, of acknowledgement. The ledger, the journals, the notebooks all were tools of power, and the Harper triplets wielded them with decades of patience, precision, and silence. The valley exhaled around him, the forest shifted. The triplets had not attacked. Yet in that moment, Carver knew the reckoning had only begun. The mist thickened as night settled into the valley, swallowing the clearing in a dense, cold silence. Deputy Carver, still clutching both the ledger and the sister's notebook, remained standing before the Harper triplets. Their pale faces glimmered in the lantern light, eyes reflecting decades of secrets. Lydia spoke first, her voice soft but unwavering. "You've seen our records, you've followed our paths, but seeing is not understanding. The valley taught us, shaped us, and demanded loyalty. Every life, every death, it was a lesson." Carver's throat tightened. Lessons, these are crimes: murder, concealment, manipulation. Children harmed, family destroyed. How could you justify any of it? The second sister, the quiet one, stepped forward. Divine justification. She said, almost matter-of-factly, "Our father taught us that the bloodline must remain pure, that the covenant demanded obedience, that any outside influence would corrupt what he built. To protect the valley, to honor the covenant, we acted." Carver shook his head. "You killed your brothers. You allowed children to die. How is that protection?" The third sister, youngest by appearance but with an intensity that made the hairs on his neck rise, whispered, "You think of protection in mortal terms. We think of legacy. The covenant is eternal. Every life we touched, every name recorded. It was for the valley to remember, to maintain balance. The town forgot, but we never did." Carver turned to the journals. The meticulous entries, the careful annotations, the coded marks, it all made sense now. Each death, each disappearance, each hidden act of cruelty was catalogued, justified, and preserved. The sisters had not acted out of malice, not entirely. They had acted from conviction, devotion to a belief that warped morality and made secrecy a necessity. And the children, Carver pressed, voice breaking. "The ones born deformed, the ones you buried, what were they? Experiments." Lydia's eyes softened, though her expression remained unreadable. "They were consequences. Consequences of the covenant. The purity demanded sacrifices. We mourned in our own way. We recorded. We remembered. The ledger holds every sorrow, every choice, every result. It is our confession, our memorial." Carver exhaled slowly, the weight of their words pressing on him. The valley itself seemed to respond, the wind whispering through the ridges, carrying the echoes of lives lost and secrets hidden for decades. "You want justice," the quiet sister said, "but justice here is different. You cannot undo what has been done. You can only bear witness." Carver looked at them, the ledger, the journals. He realized the full scale of the valley's darkness, the depth of the covenant's grip, and the meticulous order the sisters had imposed over decades. They were not just perpetrators, they were guardians, historians, and executioners of their own divine rule. The mist pressed closer. Carver understood that Ridgetown, the valley, the forgotten children all were entwined in a history that demanded remembrance. The sisters' confessions were not mere words. They were the echo of generations, the covenant's shadow stretched across time. And now Carver was the next witness. Dawn had begun to creep across the ridge, spilling pale light into the valley that had held secrets for decades. Deputy Carver stood in the clearing, the ledger and the sisters' journal spread at his feet. Their weight more than physical, they carried the moral gravity of generations. The triplets remained silent, their eyes fixed on him with an unspoken expectation. They had revealed everything: the children, the murders, the covenant, and now the question was not whether he knew the truth, but what he would do with it. Carver exhaled slowly, the crisp morning air filling his lungs. He realized that exposing the Harper sisters and the valley's hidden horrors would not be straightforward. The ledger held irrefutable evidence, but the town had long been complicit in forgetting, in ignoring the signs, in turning away from the darkness they feared to confront. He thought of the boardhouse messages, the anonymous carvings, the flood, the journals, the ledger. The sisters had orchestrated a reckoning for the town in their own time, using silence as both shield and weapon. Now, the moral weight fell on him. Could the people of Ridgetown endure the truth? Could they face the consequences of decades of neglect, ignorance, and complicity? The triplets shifted slightly, in unison, their presence commanding the silence of the valley. Lydia's voice broke the stillness. "It is not enough to punish. You must understand. You must ensure the Covenant's lessons are seen, even if you cannot carry them out. Balance is preserved not by vengeance, but by remembrance." Carver nodded slowly, understanding for the first time the full scope of what he faced. The ledger and journals were more than proof. They were a map, a history, a warning. They held the pattern of human behavior, the consequences of unchecked secrecy, and the fragile morality of those who manipulate it. He gathered the ledger and the journals carefully, the paper brittle beneath his fingers. The triplets stepped back, fading into the forest shadows, leaving him with the silent burden of knowledge. He knew he could not expose every detail without risking panic, outrage, and perhaps even more tragedy. But he could tell the story selectively, deliberately in a way that would honor the dead, document the crimes, and warn the living. As he ascended the ridge back toward the town, the valley remained quiet. The mist lingered, curling between the trees like memory itself, a reminder of the hidden horrors beneath its calm exterior. Carver's steps were measured, each footfall a promise to bear witness without allowing fear to dominate his judgment. By the time he reached the outskirts of Ridgetown, the town was stirring. Children played along muddy streets, women hung laundry, men prepared for the day's work. Nothing appeared unusual, yet Carver knew the balance had shifted. The valley's secrets were no longer entirely hidden. The ledger and the journals were now in his hands, and he would carry them carefully, a reckoning, not of punishment alone, but of history and truth. The Harper sisters had vanished into the shadows, leaving their legacy intact. Carver understood that some stories could not be fully told, but they could be remembered, and in remembering, perhaps the town could begin to confront its own role in the darkness. The valley exhaled with him, carrying the weight of centuries. Weeks passed, and the valley remained unchanged in appearance, yet beneath its quiet exterior, the story of the Harper sisters began to ripple outward. Deputy Carver had returned to Ridgetown, ledger and journals in hand, carrying the burden of truths too terrible to ignore. The town went about its daily routines, unaware of the depth of darkness that had once operated in its midst. But Carver now understood that forgetting was no longer an option. He convened a small, trusted circle, a few townsfolk who had shown integrity and courage, those who could bear the knowledge without succumbing to fear or denial. Together, they pored over the ledgers and journals, deciphering codes, cross-referencing events, and reconstructing decades of concealment. Each page revealed layers of cruelty, devotion to the Covenant, and the meticulous precision with which the sisters had orchestrated the valley's hidden history. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the triplets had not only been survivors, but also architects of a system that transcended morality as the town understood it. The ledger documented every infant lost to deformity, every brother silenced for dissent, every worker who had vanished quietly into the folds of the valley. Yet it also revealed the sisters' methodical reasoning, their theological justification, and the obsessive care with which they documented every consequence of their actions. Carver realized the Harper sisters' influence extended far beyond mere crime. They had shaped the valley itself, its rhythms, its memories, its shadows, leaving behind a legacy of control, fear, and meticulous order. It was a chilling reminder that evil could be methodical, patient, and hidden, and that even generations of silence could not erase the truth entirely. As news of the investigation slowly reached select officials, the town began to confront the ripple effects. Families who had worked on the Harper estate, descendants of those who had been complicit in silence, and even distant relatives were forced to reckon with a history that had been deliberately obscured. Some refused to believe it. Others were shaken to their cores. but none could ignore the evidence Carver and his circle had painstakingly preserved. Carver himself remained haunted by the experience. He understood that the Harper triplets, though physically absent, still exerted influence over the valley. Their journals, ledgers, and the patterns they had inscribed into the very land were a perpetual reminder that the past could never be fully buried. He took solace in one thing: the truth, once uncovered, could no longer be hidden. And in that truth lay a fragile form of justice, a legacy that demanded remembrance and reflection. The valley exhaled, mist curling over the ridges like a spectral hand brushing the earth. The Harper sisters had vanished, but their story lingered, etched into the land, the journals, and the collective memory of the town. The covenant had ended, yet its shadow remained, a cautionary tale of obedience, secrecy, and the extremes to which devotion could drive human beings. Deputy Carver closed the ledger one final time, looking out over the ridges. The sun broke through the morning fog, illuminating the valley in golden light. The horrors of the past had been exposed, the sisters' secrets laid bare, and the town forced to remember. And in that remembrance, the valley and its people could begin to reckon with the weight of history, the endurance of secrets, and the chilling power of the Harper sisters' legacy. The end.